Hello, Indianapolis. Hello, Four Cs. Unforeseen circumstances brought me back to Michigan, but I am delighted to be here with you, at least virtually. The title of my talk is Civic Disobedience, Graffiti is Rhetorical Tactic. And I'm Danielle Nicole DeVoss. I'm a professor of professional writing at Michigan State University, where I'm also the director of digital humanities, and I run a lab called the Creativity Exploratory, which is a creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship lab for the College of Arts and Letters. Shh. I'm going to share a story and describe a moment in time. And this story takes place in Lansing, Michigan, but we're going to start a few miles down the road in Detroit. Lansing is about 90 minutes west of Detroit. If you're hip to the urban art and graffiti scene, you might know about the Heidelberg Project and Banksy's mark on Detroit. Detroit has attracted a lot of attention over the past few years, in part due to political scandals, its bankruptcy as a city, and in part for its ruin porn aspects, the draw of the beauty of urban decay. And there is something so beautiful and haunting about much of Detroit's landscape. Shh. This is the abandoned Michigan Central Railroad Depot. This view gives you a better sense of scale. The Detroit Free Press, or FREEP, has described Detroit's unique profile as a kind of laboratory of extreme urban dilapidation and nascent revitalization. If you haven't seen the Detroit episode of Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, I highly, highly recommend it. Banksy hit Detroit in 2010. That's it. Banksy hit Detroit in 2010 on the grounds of the partially abandoned Packard plant, which takes up more than 3.5 million square feet on 40 acres. I say partially abandoned because there's one company that still lists the plant as its address, and there's one urban squatter / caretaker, Alan Hill, who lives there full time. I say partially abandoned because it's a hot spot for photographers and urban explorers. There's so many other stories to tell about Detroit, about public art in Detroit, about what's happening in and around the Packard plant in Detroit. The Packard plant is just one of about 80,000 abandoned residential and commercial buildings within Detroit city limits. But back to Banksy. Banksy hit the Packard plant in 2010. Within a few days of people realizing that Banksy left his mark, a gallery / grassroots group excavated all 1,500 pounds of the piece. They moved it to their gallery space located near the foot of the Ambassador Bridge, which connects Detroit and Windsor, Canada. After it was discovered they had removed the piece, the artist put it into storage at an undisclosed location. This is really interesting, given that graffiti is typically anchored to its space and moment and its publicness. So this piece sat somewhere in Detroit, hidden and inaccessible. The gallery was sued by the owners of the Packard facility, who argued that the art was theirs and worth at least $100,000. They wound up settling. The gallery paid $2,500 for the piece, and in 2012, it was put back on display. What's also interesting here is that when BioResource Inc. came forward to sue the gallery, it allowed the city of Detroit to identify them as the responsible property owners of the old Packard plant. The city had been trying for years to figure out who was the responsible owner of the property. In late 2013, the Packard plant facility was purchased by a developer. This past January 2014, he claimed the title of the entire facility. He bought it at public auction for about $400,000. But he's in court now with BioResource, that original property owner on the plant's grounds, who claims they retained ownership of 4 acres of the plant and are fighting for it. Just last week, March 4th, 2014, 2 Detroit artists came forward to claim they actually painted the piece attributed to Banksy. People are really skeptical, though, and there's a growing suspicion around Detroit that they came forward just to disrupt the sale of the piece, because the gallery is trying to sell the Banksy piece, hoping to bring in anywhere from $200,000 to $1.2 million. Banksy's comment on people having purchased his work in the past has been, "I can't believe you morons actually buy this shit." He has also commented that graffiti is not meant to last forever. It has a kairotic moment and place in space. I love this example because it's a story of fame, of art, of civic disobedience, rhetoric, space, place, time, theft, and more, economically, culturally, and geographically entrenched. But it's not the story I want to tell here. I want to go back 90 miles down the road to Lansing and consider another moment in time. For years, the Deluxe Inn sat at the intersection of I-496 and Washington Avenue, approximately 5 blocks from the state capitol building. It essentially served as a geographic and visual entry from the capital area into Rio Town, an area of Lansing that housed an Oldsmobile plant until the 1970s and now houses a 2.5 million square foot GM facility on 111 acres of land. The acreage this plant covers is almost 3 times the size of the Detroit Packard plant. It runs along the Grand River. You get a better sense of the plant from this map. And this map shows the entire area of the facility. The blank spaces to our left are where buildings stood until about 3 years ago. Then the owners demoed several old buildings and cleared out the area. The entire west side of the plant is now essentially a parking lot. Sometimes it's used to store cars post-assembly before they're trucked out. Other times it sits empty. Not all of the buildings are being used. This building, for instance, is ghost office space. It was once administrative offices for the plant, but some of the windows are broken. Close up, you can see tarp-covered desks and boxes and office machines. About a year ago, GM wrapped the building, turning it into an 8-story, 360-degree billboard for the Cadillac ATS, made it the plant in the operational buildings. About 2 weeks ago, on March 5th, 2014, GM announced that they plan to build a $162 million stamping plant on the grounds. So unlike the Packard plant in Detroit, this is a living, breathing facility that, again, serves as an anchor for Rio Town, where the Deluxe Inn once stood. The Deluxe Inn was a problem spot, with almost 1 911 call per day in 2004. In 2006, the city launched a case to shut it down after more than a dozen arrests happened in less than a month. Most of the people who lived there were full-time residents, and it was known as a location for drugs and prostitution. One Lansing area reporter suggested that the Deluxe Inn put the hoe in hotel. The city finally shut down the Deluxe Inn for non-payment of back taxes in 2009 and worked to relocate the tenants. The city land bank purchased the building and the grounds for $400,000, the exact same sum that the entire Packard plant facility was purchased for in Detroit. It sat boarded for months. Then in 2010, Sam DeBourbon, a.k.a. Samsky, a local Lansing kid, was arrested for destruction of property, tagging under a railroad overpass on a wall that was soon after demolished. Sam went in front of a judge and argued for community service and told the judge about an idea he had for a public art project and that he was looking at the Deluxe Inn property. Joe Manzella, a Lansing area mover and shaker and entrepreneur, worked at the time for Accelerate Lansing, and he got on board. He pulled in Eric Schertzing, Ingham County Treasurer and Director of the Ingham County Land Bank, which owned the Deluxe Inn property. Sam invited artists from Chicago, New York, LA, and more. In August 2010, the artists began work, and what started as an invite-only project became a community art project. Sam was there every day, encouraging people to bring their own paint, chatting with people, and complimenting people's work. On one of the days I stopped by, and I stop by every day, I live just a couple of blocks south of the old Deluxe Inn property. Oyster, a fairly well-known Chicago graffiti artist, was standing next to an MSU prof who came armed with at least a dozen cans of spray paint. 2 middle schoolers were tagging up on the second floor. A kid from Korea who is attending Cooley Law School in downtown Lansing was working on a piece. Painting began with little scrawls and tags and expanded from there. Some of the work took up a few inches. Some of the work took up feet of space and spanned from the ground to the roof overhang. Some of the work was aesthetic. Some was activist or political. Some was place-based and pride-based. At the end of the week, all of the walls, the doors, the entryways, the stairways, the sidewalks, the curbs, and the parking lot were covered. Scherzing, who, again, was the Ingham County Treasurer, said, "The community created this event. We just provided the palette." Manzella commented that if you take the arts and wed them to a place, you create a space where people want to be. The graffiti project stood for about a month, and then the city used the property to conduct a fire test, burning the buildings to the ground. Before the fire department descended on the property, a handful of people from Rio Town salvaged what they could. They pulled panels off walls, they cut concrete and hauled it off. There were a couple of gallery shows in the months after the Deluxe Inn graffiti project, mainly featuring photographs people took during the event. The Rio Town Business Board also commissioned an artist to paint an empty wall in a lot where a business stood for years before it burned down a few years prior. and some of the salvaged art has reappeared as planters along the Rheotown corridor. The graffiti became part of the artistic, aesthetic, and historical space of Rheotown. The lot where the Deluxe Inn was now stands bare. The only thing left on the lot was a lone pine tree on the property a woman who lived nearby asked to be saved. Scherzing's nickname for the plot is Lone Pine Parcel. In 2010, a development company pitched a plan for a multi-million-dollar mixed-use project that included restaurants and loft apartments. In the proposal, the developer said, quote, "It's got to play up the art and graffiti, the cultural grittiness becoming emblematic of Rheotown," end quote. After the lot sat completely empty for a few months, artists in Rheotown got together and used scrap metal from old doors and metal ceiling tiles and welded a Rheotown sign that sits on the property. This was its original paint job in mosaic. It's been painted over at least 3 or 4 times since then. I don't want to overdetermine this particular moment in Lansing's and Rheotown's history, but I want to note this was a pretty important moment. For me, and I suspect for many others, the Deluxe Inn project both helped showcase ongoing work to rebuild and rethink Rheotown, and to serve as a catalyst for continued change in Rheotown. Although plans were already being discussed in 2009, the contract was granted and work began in the center of Rheotown on the Board of Water and Light facility, the first new utility power plant to be built in Michigan in 25 years. During construction, the Board of Water and Light salvaged an old train depot on the property that had sat broken windows, boarded up for more than 30 years. Construction was linked to a sewer pipe and roadway sidewalk reconstruction project, and across these projects, Rheotown, which is only a couple of blocks long, was heavily under construction. Construction brought in food carts and restaurants set up in some of the abandoned storefronts. A few small companies and stores came and went during the construction. A couple of years ago, a Lansing landmark, the Cadillac Club, suffered serious fire damage when the building adjacent to it burned to the ground, a suspected arson. The owners couldn't afford to rebuild, and a discount store expanded into it. 2 weeks ago, that shut down. They have another building about a block south, but there's a for sale sign on it, and I'm not sure if that location's going to stay. When I looked this past Monday on a real estate site for the Lansing area, all of the houses for sale in Rheotown were up for between $15,000, that's 15000, and $28,000, with one at $68,000. So that's the story, and there are dozens of ways to decode and deconstruct it. It was a public art project. It was a community making and community anchoring moment. It was an act of civic disobedience engaged by dozens and viewed by thousands. It was certainly scandalous and provoked contention in the area, and almost as many as celebrated it rallied against the project and against the destruction it perpetrated. I wish I had salvaged all of the communication at the moment. I remember reading one public comment on a Lansing State Journal article, that's our local newspaper, owned by a much, much larger umbrella corporation, about the graffiti project that read, quote, "Allowing a graffiti artist to do something like this is like buying a pedophile a house next to a school," end quote. Rheotown is still figuring out what its identity is in the 21st century, as is Lansing, and artists like Sam are helping us on that track. I've been thinking of this particular happening as a case of tactile tactics, a way of mark-making, space-making, and place-making. This is public rhetoric happening, situated in a time, space, and location. That time, space, and location are inseparably bound to the dynamics and history of Lansing, Michigan, a state capital, one of the anchor cities in Michigan in terms of automobile production, the third largest city in the state. In the 1970s, Frank D'Angelo published 2 pieces in College Composition and Communication on graffiti. He offered a wide-angle view of the doodlings and drawings that span the visual landscape of our campuses. He compared the particular type of graffiti he was looking at as to proverbs, in that they're concise, direct, pithy, and incisive, that they contain moral and ethical truths and are anchored to audience and placed into circulation by the masses. In his 74-piece, D'Angelo is focused on quote-unquote crude doodlings and the ways in which they drew upon allusion, pun, irony, alliteration, and more. In his later piece, published in 1975, he situated graffiti as a means for critique of advertising. Much more recently, Jeffrey Sirk, in a 1997 piece called Never Mind the Tag Memics, Where's the Sex Pistols?, wrote about punk and anchored its genres with the media of collective space, including graffiti. In 2005, in a piece called Living Room, Teaching Public Writing in a Post-Publicity Era, Nancy Welch explored the rhetorical movements and moments beyond the classroom, reading city streets and graffitied walls. She described the tangible nature of public writing. Welch described what a public voice might sound like in a, quote, radically distinct postmodern, post-industrial society, end quote. I think this is what that voice might sound like. I have to admit that for the last 3 C's, I've come to the conference with some ideas and some stories and no conclusions. I don't have any grand claims or conclusions about these acts, this mark making, this public moment, these moments of civic disobedience. But I do have some approaches I'm exploring and some questions to share. It's impossible for me not to turn my eyes toward Deserto. What happens when a micro-resistance gains velocity? When one kid tagging under a bridge becomes mass communal moment of mark-making and civic disobedience? What can we take from these moments and these messages, from this making of rhetorical space through these tactile tactics of civic disobedience? I don't know yet, but I have a lot of questions. And I think it's events like what happened at the Deluxe Inn that will help us address these questions. My questions range from what counts as art, and how might our standards or understandings of public art necessarily shift in a transforming cultural and economic climate? What is a city, lowercase c-i-t-y, and what is a city, uppercase C, uppercase I, uppercase T, uppercase Y? Lansing is a state capital, and due to that and other reasons, Lansing's capital C-I-T-Y cityness is codified and will stay fixed. But Detroit is another space altogether. For Detroit to thrive in the coming years, I think we need to reconceptualize what that city is, and people are doing that in Detroit. I think we're witnessing evolving relationships between cities and the arts. About 60 miles west of Lansing, the opposite direction of Detroit, is Grand Rapids, which has hosted Art Prize for the past few Octobers. Art Prize is a citywide arts event. For 19 days, 3 square miles of downtown Grand Rapids becomes a space where art happens. And over the last year or two, the locations of the art have moved beyond just the downtown area and across the entire larger Grand Rapids locale. Anyone over the age of 18 can display their art. Any space can be a venue. As the Art Prize organizers state on their website, it's unorthodox, highly disruptive, and undeniably intriguing to the art world and the public alike. When Art Prize launched in 2009, it was labeled a social experiment by its designer. The art spreads across the city, in the trees, in the Grand River. The largest cash prize in the art world is determined by popular vote, facilitated by conversation and enabled by mobile devices. So what sorts of relationships are cities shaping to public arts, cultural, economic, historic, educational, and more? I'm really interested in when and how cities own and claim graffiti. Orbiting questions have to do with who gets to name and sanction spaces, who gets to say art can happen here, who gets to make decisions about what art is and where it comes from and where it goes. And I have even more questions. What fuels artists' interest in creation? What happens when the space is sanctioned? In what ways are the tactile tactics constrained or reshaped when a city endorses the artwork? I'm also really interested in what happens when graffiti, traditionally a solo artist activity, becomes a community-oriented, collaborative art form. And this is happening all over the world, of course, so I think we need both local and global views of these actions. We need some fine-grained context and situated narratives, and we need some explanation. And I wonder if we're in a moment where, again, art is changing shape. I'm interested in seeing ripple effects as vernacular arts continue to rub up against quote-unquote high arts. We may claim to be postmodern, but our artistic entrenchments are so often modernist, and our laws, regulations, and policies enacted in our institutions and in our cities reflect this bias. And so, I'll stop here without offering any answers, but instead situating graffiti in time, place, and space, specifically in the 517 area code, specifically in Lansing, specifically in Michigan, mapped across bodies and publics, posing some interesting possibilities about graffiti as tactile, rhetorical tactic. Thank you.